This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hello and welcome to Thank You Mama. My name is Anna Tyler. My guest today is Rev Shell or Reverend Shell. Hello, Michelle. And welcome.
Hi, how are you, Anna? Thank you for having me.
You. So Michelle is a metaphysical minister, a family constellation facilitator, and a clinical hypnotist. And I have to ask you something. I already had a reverend as a guest on my podcast, and I forgot to ask her. Mm-hmm. I have a very international audience, and here in the United States, when we say reverend, we know what we mean. But I think for my international audience, we might maybe want to explain what that means.
So I'm an ordained metaphysical minister with the International Metaphysical Church, and really what that means or how I use my title as Reverend, I do it in a couple of ways. Number one, I built, or I should say my ministry or my service to people, because to me being a minister is about service. And my service to people is in the works that I do with family constellations. And I also provide basic ministerial services, things like marrying couples, funerals, baptizing or blessing babies, houses, doing the kind of ministerial things for communities that generally are not accepted in mainstream religion and church. So communities like the queer community, the poly community, the kink communities, pagan communities, communities of people that you wouldn't find regularly in Christian churches and tend to be more of the metaphysical or the pagan side. I provide services to them that they might need.
Mm-hmm. And I am very excited to have you as my guest because I found you somewhere in a podcasters group, and I read that your work revolves around our mothers and specifically what you call a mother wound.
Yes.
And I was like, I want to talk to this lady, please.
Well, here I am.
Yay, welcome. So will you tell me more about that side of your work?
Yeah. So I think the number one question that I get from people when I start to talk about my work is, what is a mother wound? Some people are versed on that and understand it right away. And some people are like, I don't even know what that means. So a mother wound in the context of my work, and I work only with women. And now there are men who have mother wounds, but they manifest up and they show up differently. I only work with women. From the scope of my work, the mother wound is a wound that we carry as women when we are either over-mothered or under-mothered. So under-mothered is the neglectful, abusive mothers, the ones that don't give us the nurturing and the love that we need. And the over-motherings are the ones that suffocate us, the ones that control everything that we do. As an adult woman, maybe you never have the opportunity to make a decision about your life on your own because your mother is has interjected herself into your life so much. So that's what over-mothering might look like. And because our mother really is our first love, because she is the one that teaches us about connection.
This is so interesting.
Okay.
You said connection, and the connection got lost. This was spooky.
No. Okay, so I'll go back to there. So
I think I want to edit this because this is awesome. Okay, connection.
Yes. So our mothers are the ones that teach us first really about how to connect with other people, teach us about trust and nurturing and attachment and boundaries and, all these key core lessons that we learn as a result of our relationship with our mother. And to be honest with you, it starts before we're even born. It starts in utero with the emotional climate that we are gestated in. Is mom healthy and happy when she's pregnant with us? Or that might, have a whole different emotional imprint on a child than somebody whose mother was maybe distressed or was depressed or wasn't in a healthy relationship and wasn't getting the care that she needed, right? So that creates a different emotional imprint in the baby. And so it really starts in utero and it moves all the way through our life. And the mother wound, or the wounds that we carry because of the way that we were mothered, it really does impact our relationships, our careers, our finances, our health, our parenting, our fertility. It really just affects every area of our life. And most of these lessons or most of these wounds and most of the ways that it affects us are subconscious. Like we don't even know that we're doing it until we actually start to put the pieces together and connect the dots. And that's where I come in. That's what I help women do.
Michelle, I'd like to talk about two points. One is I read on your website, which I loved. You have a special point saying we're not blaming mom. We just want to recognize what her circumstances or her modus operandi, I don't have a better word, was.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of fear or a lot of stigma, right, of the way that we talk about mom, and we're hardly ever encouraged to say anything but positive words about mom, right? Mom,
yes,
we have to protect her, right?
Yes.
We have to make her seem like she's the best mom in the world out there. And so we never really get to talk about like the things that happened between our mothers that wounded us. And so I'm trying to normalize that conversation. And in doing that, I had to be really clear and specific as in that we are not blaming mom. We have to look at the system of the family because most mother wounds are generational, which means that we're looking at the way that you were mothered, and we're looking at the way that mom was mothered, and we're looking at the way that grandma was mothered, because all of these circumstances culminate into the person that you are. And so we can't blame mom because mom was a byproduct of her environment, and we can't blame grandma because grandma was a byproduct of her environment. What we can do is look at the patterns within the family system, and it's within those patterns that we find the root, and we also find the healing.
Michelle, that was exactly my second point that I find so fascinating in your work and in general in now dealing with this topic of mother is exactly that, this generational patterns that do often seem to, and sometimes they're so obvious. I do have a few friends where I can witness it through 3 or 4 generations. But then there are situations like my family, for instance, where my grandmother died when she was 32. How would we work with that? Because we can't find out how she was mothered.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the work that I do, it really comes from the broad scope of family constellations, right? So family constellations was created by Bert Hellinger, influenced by many different types of psychotherapy, spiritual systems, and, it all culminated into this practice of family constellations. And within that, there was another person who emerged from that by the name of Mark Wolin. Mark Wolin wrote a book that's been very popular, and you might have heard of it, called It Didn't Start With You. Mm-hmm. And he really starts talking about in there, like the what he has created called the core language approach. And the core language approach is really a way of dissecting the family system using the language that you use, right? So if I'm working with a client and they know mom, but maybe don't know grandma, well, first of all, I'm going to take the perspective of my client that has of her mother, and then I'm going to talk about not my client's understanding of her grandmother, but what does her mother say about her mother? So it's from the perspective of you're going to know your mom most of the time. I mean, there are circumstances where you might not, but if you know your mom, you're going to know how she speaks of the relationship of her grandmother. And through that, we can often pick up patterns within the family system that help us get to the root of the core trauma. And so we don't necessarily need to know like the deep family history. What we need to know is what are the words that have been used that resonate within the family throughout the generations that describe the people in your family. Tell me some of the stories that you've heard and what is the underlying narrative of those stories. And from there, we can pull out a lot of the information that we need to get to the root of why and how this particular issue that you're working on is presenting itself in your life. So that was a long answer, but it kind of tells you where it came from.
It's fascinating. It's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Michelle, let's talk about you and your mom.
So my mom's name is Karen, and I think I knew really early on in life that she was not a well woman. My mom was the youngest daughter of an alcoholic woman. So my grandmother was an addict, and her drug of choice was alcohol. My mom was the youngest, and she said that she always felt like the black sheep of the family, the one that was rejected the most. And so my mom lived her whole life feeling completely abandoned by her mom and very inadequate in life. And I think It's not been diagnosed, but I have this sneaky suspicion that because my grandmother was an alcoholic, that my mother was born with fetal alcohol effects. Like she didn't have syndrome, but she definitely had maybe some effects. And I think that caused some undiagnosed mental illness in my mom.
What does that mean?
So if a pregnant woman drinks alcohol, like is an addict and is an alcoholic while she's pregnant, there can have effects on the baby that range from very severe to very mild. And because my grandmother was an alcoholic, I suspect that she was drinking when she was pregnant with my mom. And that caused my mom to have some cognitive disabilities that were very undetected. And never got diagnosed. And I think with that also came some mental illness, like depression, maybe bipolarism, but never diagnosed because my mom she wasn't the type to go to the doctor and get help like that.
Where did you grow up?
California.
Okay.
California here in the States. Yeah. And so, my mom herself became, as an adult, became an addict. She got very involved in the hippie culture, the dark part of the hippie culture that was doing a lot of drugs, and that addiction just followed her whole life. So there were 5 of us. I have an older sister, myself, and I have 3 younger siblings, and all of us were in and out of foster homes. And my oldest sister was actually removed by the state and placed into an adoptive home because they found my mother not capable of caring for her. And then I came along, and again, in and out of foster homes my whole life. And then my brothers and sisters came along. And I think the last stint that my mom had, where she had the kids, she went into a really deep addictive cycle, and the kids got taken away and they never went back. So she had 5 kids. All of them except for myself, because I ended up getting married when I was a teenager. All of them except for myself went into the foster care system and were adopted. And so if you think about if you think about the frame of my work, I was very undermothered. I had huge attachment issues. I've never really battled addiction. That wasn't my thing, but I definitely battled codependency, right? So I was the other end of it, where I was people pleasing and had huge codependent tendencies. But even through that, I still loved my mom. She was not a good mother, but I still loved her. And I think what I know now through the work that I do is that that's a very normal feeling. Children, even when they have parents who are not healthy and do not nurture them and do not provide the home and the nurturing and love that they need, still we love our parents because they are our parents. And I don't think that I really understood that, though, until I really became an adult, when I think I was maybe in my early 20s when I started to see my mom as a whole autonomous person outside of motherhood. And I think with that perspective, I was able to have a little more compassion for her. It's
amazing you managed to do that young. That's very adult for somebody in their 20s.
It is. But I also had the privilege of a lot of therapy and counseling because I was a ward of the state. Like I was in foster homes. You have to go to counseling on a regular basis. So I've been exposed to therapy since I was a young child. And I feel really fortunate because I had a lot of tools to be able to process a lot of this. That doesn't mean, though, that I didn't deal with my codependency. I didn't deal with my abandonment issues and that kind of stuff well into my 30s and even my early 40s. But I was able to see her as a whole person outside of my mom. And what I saw was somebody who was really wounded and very sad. And she died, my mom died, I think it was 2000, so almost 20 years ago. And I would spend the next 20 years really doing my mother wound healing. I feel like we've done more healing work together in the last 10 years than we ever did when she was alive.
But that's amazing that you can do this even when they're not here. And I spoke to one of my guests who said maybe it's even easier because there is no interruption and feedback.
I agree with that. It is definitely, I won't say it's easier. I'm going to say from my experience and in my particular situation, I don't have anything to compare it to, right? Because I came into the work that I do long after my mom was gone. I do have lots of clients who are in active, relationship with their mom. And sometimes I do think that it is easier to do when you get to create the whole narrative and you don't have that pushback, because you get to create the healing space and you don't have to worry about being sunken into, that place that mom can sink you into when she starts to criticize or when she starts to get into that same triggering behavior. But the flip side of that is when mom passes, you don't get to feel what it's like to be in relationship with her physically once you've done your healing. And that can also be really, really sad too, because, you want to be able to have that healthy relationship with mom. And if she's gone, you can't do that. The fact that that really good, deep healing work can be done even after mom is gone is just proof that, mother wound healing is not about mom. It's not about, the physical relationship that you have with her, but it is more about how you work through your trauma, how you metabolize it, and then how you create an inner image that lends to a more healthy dynamic between you and the inner image of your mom. And then how do you shift that to then reparenting the little girl in you, who at the core of it is just needing to be honored and treasured. And you switch from having mom and needing mom to meet that need to learning how to do that for yourself. And that's really where the healing comes in.
Michelle, because I'm so interested in this generational inheritance of patterns, do you mind telling your story and how it connects to your mom's story? Or
Sure. It's very interesting because, one of the things that I've learned is that systems marry systems. So when I talk about systems, I'm talking about your family system. And so what I noticed in my family system is that there was a subconscious or even conscious rejection of parenting from the women in my family, not just on my mom's side, but even on my dad's side. And so when I say systems marry systems, our parents somehow complemented the systems that they came from to keep these generational stories going. So let me kind of share what that looks like in my book. So I'm going to start with my great-grandmother because that's the most that I know. So my great-grandmother was a young mother. She was a married school teacher, and she was involved in an abusive marriage to my great-grandfather. She had to leave that, and she was in Minnesota at the time. She left that, and she moved to California. She almost had to escape, right? I understand it was very volatile, very abusive. And so when she got to California, all of her energy went to getting a job, getting a home, and providing stability for her two daughters, one of which was my grandmother. And my grandmother was the oldest daughter. And so what happened is with my great-grandmother focusing all of her attention on work and not really being able to be there for the kids like she wanted to, my grandmother and her sister really had to rely on friends and neighbors and even themselves to raise themselves. So the wounds of my grandmother, who had an alcoholic and abusive father, and a mother who had to work and really wasn't there, showed up in her own alcoholism and her own need to escape her pain and trauma and never really dealing with that. So my grandmother has 3 kids. She has her oldest daughter, my uncle, and then my mom. My oldest aunt, my mom's oldest sister, died when she was young, completely traumatized my grandmother, who then just continued. My mom already felt like, she was the outcast of the family. But when she lost her older sister, the abuse onto my mom got even more. And so she eventually just left. And she had a very tumultuous relationship with her mother. And she always felt like her mother never loved her. Her mother was never there. It's almost the same lessons that my grandmother would have about her mother, like she wasn't there, right? So it's this rejection of mothering in a sense. So my mother takes all of her pain and she starts to have a family. And the same thing happens. She loses her older daughter.
Very young.
Yeah, very young. She didn't lose her to death, but she left her to the system. I lost her to foster care and adoption. And then by my mother's behavior and how we were in and out of foster care, again, a separate rejection of motherhood, right? So here I come. I am the second oldest daughter. I get married, and I get married when I get pregnant at 13. I get married at 14, and I have 3 children. Now, because I was the oldest daughter in the home, remember my oldest sister, she was taken away. I was the oldest daughter in the home. I was the one who was responsible for keeping the household going when I was there, and, making sure that everybody had what they needed, taking care of my mom, taking care of my younger brothers and sisters, and really being the parent at that time, as a young child myself. So by the time I had my own kids and I was going through my own divorce, I was exhausted. My children went to go live with their dad for about 10 years. And so here we have another incidence of a mother who's rejecting parenting, right? So it's like 4 generations at this point where mothers are not raising their babies. And so then when I go to my father's side and I go back to his mom, same thing. My dad was not raised by his mother. He was raised by his grandmother. And his grandfather. And so there's these generations of just women on both sides that are somehow rejecting parenting. And so that culminates into the circumstances around my own rejection of parenting, right? I get married young. I'm exhausted by the time we're divorced. I need to take a break. My children go live with their ex-husband or with my ex-husband. And it caused all of these problems in my family. It caused my own children to feel rejected, caused my own daughter to have her issues when she got older. And this cycle started to rise up where my daughter, after her divorce, her children, one went to live with me, one went to live with their dad. And so we've had to be really hyper aware of keeping the family together because there's this generational pattern of women who are not raising their children. And so that's just like one example of how these generational stories and narratives can travel through the families. And it wasn't until I put all that down on paper in a genogram and I actually looked at it that I was like, wow.
Wow. Yes.
What it did for me though, Anna, is it made me feel like I wasn't alone, and I was no longer ashamed because I felt like it was all my fault, that everything that I was doing in my life was completely my fault. Now I take responsibility for my decisions, but when there's this underlying narrative that runs through your family, whatever it is, and you're able to see it for the first time, and this is why the family mapping and the generational mapping is so important, because I got to see it in my family tree and go, I'm not alone, but I get to stop it. I get to be the one that says, we're not doing this anymore.
Did you work with your, with your daughter?
Yeah, we did. Even though there was a time where, she needed to kind of take and get herself together, there was never this complete desertion. We came together as a family to make sure that everybody had what they needed, which was so different than what happened to me and what happened to my mom, right? It was the narrative that we held as, we're a family, we take care of each other, whatever you need, I'm going to support you. It wasn't always roses and popsicles either. There were some tough times in there, but I believe because we shifted the narrative from abandonment to support, it changed the legacy that we live in.
Fantastic. Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Michelle, apropos legacy, let's go into your mom's lessons. I'm very, very curious to hear what you've learned from her and from all of this.
Yeah, great question. I believe that, my mom wasn't the type of woman to sit down and, teach me these hard life lessons. I think I had to learn a lot of that on my own. What I did learn, though, from her was really in hindsight through my own healing. And I think there were 4 key lessons that I learned from her. The first one really is compassion for the full woman that she was outside of motherhood, and really having the perspective of who she was before she became a mom. And in that, recognizing really what she had and she didn't have to give me. And that she was allowed to have her own narrative outside of being a mom. And I think I learned that lesson when I was going through my own healing with my own kids and, helping them understand what it meant to be your own autonomous person outside of your children. And even my children who are now parents themselves, them learning that lesson. Two lessons are really tied together. One of them is how interdependent we are with our parents and our ancestors, and how her healing is directly tied to my healing. We try to escape our parents. We try to, oftentimes we rebel and we say things like, I'm never going to be like my mom and I'm going to be my own person. And that's fine. We can be our own person and we shouldn't be so merged with our mom that it's unhealthy. But there is this level of interdependence that we have with each other where my healing is tied to her healing in the way, and that shows up differently for everybody. The way that my healing is tied to my mother's healing was that I decided that because she couldn't, I would. And that was a really important lesson for me to do in her honor, because we are interdependent on each other. I cannot escape who she was, and I cannot escape who I am. And I also cannot reject who she is, which goes into my next lesson, which is we never escape what we reject in our mother. In the anthology that I wrote, it was mainly about the ways that I tried to reject or escape who my mother was in the parenting of my own children, only to realize that I would do the exact same thing, just in a different way. Mm-hmm. Because what we reject will find itself back to us in the form of other relationships or experiences. And so I think the lesson that I learned from my relationship with her is to just accept what is and not reject it. We don't have to accept it. We don't have to actively accept people abusing us, right? What I'm saying is that we cannot reject the idea of our mother and think that we will be whole, because we will not be. Embracing our mother for who she is and accepting our mother for who she is, flaws and all, does wonders to our own feeling of wholeness and healing. And that is probably the biggest lesson that I had to learn.
I was thinking before I got on the call with you how interesting it is that I was always so aware of these generational patterns and very consciously try to avoid them. And in a funny way, weird way, you really can't escape it. Even if you try very consciously to escape it, life just puts its blocks in this way and that, and suddenly you find yourself in the very same situation. Like, how did this happen? I did everything differently.
Because what we reject will find its way to us every single time. Yeah. It's funny, like, if you think about it, like if you reject your mother because she is overbearing and, you go no contact with her and you don't talk to her for years, I can guarantee you she's shown up somewhere else in your life. So is she like your really controlling and needy friend? Or did you marry somebody who was controlling? It always shows up. And so it just makes more sense. And we often, like, this lesson is hindsight is 2020, right? We don't see it until after it happens. But if we just learn to sit with who our parents are and accept them. And when I say accept, I'm just saying accept what is, right? Accept that, mom is controlling and she'll probably never not be. And so what do I need to do for myself to keep myself safe? And how do I set boundaries that allow me to be who I am in this relationship, right? Because mom's never going to change. Nothing you do is going to change mom. You got to change your center point.
Wow. Michelle, is there anything... This is a tricky question, especially in our conversation, but is there anything you feel like she was not able to teach you? And I know there was a lot, but is there anything you would like to pinpoint, important things you had to learn yourself?
Yeah, I think she wasn't able to teach me how to not give away parts of myself so that I could feel loved. She didn't teach me how to not do that. And that led to years and years and years of codependency and people pleasing. And I think, I joke sometimes with, my people who know me, and, I always talk about how I have to be hypervigilant about codependent behaviors because I call myself a recovering codependent. I wish she would have been able to teach me how not to give pieces of myself away so that I can feel loved.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
That's a whole new episode.
It really is. Yeah.
Oh, wow. But do you feel you learned it yourself?
I think I'm going to be learning it my whole life.
Yes.
But when I came into constellation work and I came into the mother wound work that I do now, it was probably the deepest healing I ever had to do. Like, because you can't do this work and not do your own work. And so I had to really face these things within myself. And it just so happened that I was in the midst of a situation with my own daughter where I, overcompensated and showed up in a way that was very rescuing, and I wanted to do everything for her and do everything that my mom never did for me. And it was such an overcompensation and codependent situation. And it really slapped me in the face. Like, I mean, it threw a wedge in the relationship between my daughter and I for a long time. And even between my spouse and I, it caused a lot of problems in my home because I wanted, I was trying to make up for the things that I hadn't done before. And I wanted to do what my mom never did for me. And what I did is I took agency away from my daughter, and I took away from her the opportunity to really develop and own her own fate. And in constellation work, we learned that everybody has to carry their own fate. Mom has to carry her own fate, and children have to carry their own fate. And I didn't do that. And I think that was the last time where I was really in some damaging codependent relationships. And I had to take a big step back there. And I was right in the middle of training for this. So it was like the perfect time because I had to face it, or else I wouldn't have been able to, get through my training. And I'm so thankful because it completely created a whole new legacy in my family around that.
Oh, wow. Michelle, we'd have so much more to talk about.
Yeah, we could go on and on.
We could go on and on. It's amazing. I'm very fascinated with your work and these topics. But let me try to recap. I'd like to just quickly recap the lessons I took from you.
Okay.
First, compassion for the full woman. Then to understand how interdependent we are with our ancestors. As the third one, that we can never escape, that what we reject will catch up with us sooner or later. Yeah. And thus to accept and heal, to accept what is and to heal, and that our healing is tied to our mother's healing or other way around. We heal each other. Yeah. Yeah. And then we do. And then as the lesson she did not teach you was how to not give away parts of yourself in order to be loved, which is a big one.
Yeah, those are it.
Michelle, thank you so much for being my guest. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Oh, gosh. The work of healing your mother wound is a lifelong process. I think clients come to me, or my clients come to me because they are just ripe to do the work right now. This is the part of their life that they're at. And I feel very honored and I feel very humbled to be able to hold space for my clients in the way that I do at this stage in their life, because this is such important work. It really does recreate a new foundation for which you see the world when you are able to shift the way you hold your mom in your heart. And so to the listeners, if you are interested in looking at what this work might mean for you, I would love to talk with you.
I'd love to talk with you as well, Michelle.
Yeah.
Okay, I will put all your information in the episode notes, as I always do.
Awesome.
And thank you again for being my guest.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking with you today. I'm honored that you had me here.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyoumama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider. That's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.